Police brutalize a black woman over a parking spot, completely unaware of who they're dealing with. A simple misunderstanding spirals into an unnecessary confrontation, exposing how prejudice and power can collide in the most startling ways. What happens when the truth comes out and the officers realize who they've targeted? It begins in an ordinary parking lot, where a minor dispute over a space turns into a dramatic escalation. The black woman, calm and collected, attempts to resolve the issue, but her efforts are met with hostility. The officers arrive, assuming the worst without asking the necessary questions or understanding the full picture. Their demeanor becomes aggressive, and what should have been a routine interaction takes a shocking turn. But this woman isn't just anyone. Her poised and dignified response masks a life filled with hard work, resilience, and accomplishment. She's a Supreme Court judge, a symbol of justice and integrity in the nation. Her journey has been anything but easy, but through her dedication, she has risen to one of the most respected positions in the country. Yet, in this moment, the officers see none of this. They overlook her humanity and assume the worst based on their biases. The situation quickly draws attention. Bystanders begin to record the scene, sensing something is deeply wrong. The officers, confident in their authority, continue to act aggressively, believing they're in control. But as the tension mounts, questions linger. What will happen when the truth comes out? How will they react when they discover they've targeted someone who represents the very system they claim to serve? This story highlights the danger of snap judgments and unchecked power. It forces us to confront a harsh reality, one that many face daily but rarely reaches the spotlight. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments below. Join us as we unravel the full story, one that challenges authority with the principles it's meant to uphold. What happens when justice meets injustice head-on? Stay tuned to find out. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments below. "Ma'am, step out of the car, now!" Officer Peters barked, his voice cutting through the bustling parking lot. He slammed his palm against the side of the car, making Eleanor Gray flinch. The bystanders nearby froze, their eyes darting between the officer and the composed black woman sitting behind the wheel. Eleanor slowly rolled down her window, her calm demeanor in stark contrast to the officer's aggression. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, her voice measured but firm. Peters scowled, leaning down to meet her gaze. "This is a restricted area, and you're not supposed to be parked here," he said, ignoring the fact that the parking spot had no such signs. "You're causing a disturbance, and I need you to move." "I'm parked legally," Eleanor replied, holding up a valid parking permit. Her tone remained composed, but the look in her eyes hinted at a growing resolve. "Don't try to argue with me," Peters snapped, swatting the permit away without even looking at it. "Get out of the car, or I'll make you get out." A small crowd began to gather at a safe distance, their curiosity piqued by the escalating scene. Some started pulling out their phones to record, their whispers filling the tense air. "Is that even allowed?" someone muttered. "She didn't do anything," another voice said, watching closely. Eleanor opened her car door slowly and stepped out, her every move deliberate and composed. Her presence radiated calm, but it was clear she wasn't about to back down. "Officer, I'm not resisting," she said, her voice steady. "But I must insist that you treat me with respect." "Respect?" Peters repeated with a mocking laugh, stepping closer to tower over her. "You think you're entitled to something here? This isn't up for debate." Nearby, his partner, Officer Rhodes, looked uncomfortable, but stayed silent, his eyes darting nervously between Peters and the growing crowd. Eleanor took a step back, keeping her hands visible and her demeanor calm. "I'm complying, officer. There's no need for hostility." Peters ignored her words, his tone dripping with authority. "Let me see some ID now." He gestured aggressively, signaling his impatience. Eleanor reached into her bag, retrieving her wallet. She extended her ID, her fingers steady, despite the tension thick in the air. But Peters didn't even glance at it. He snatched it out of her hand, glanced briefly, and tossed it back toward her. "I don't need your excuses," he said, his voice loud enough for the onlookers to hear. "People like you think you can just do whatever you want." The murmurs from the crowd grew louder, outrage simmering just below the surface. Some recognized Eleanor, their faces filled with shock and disbelief. "Wait, isn't she—" someone whispered. But Peters didn't notice. His focus was entirely on asserting his authority, blind to the truth that was about to unravel in front of everyone. The tension was undeniable as Officer Peters stood in front of the black woman, his posture stiff and voice sharp. Eleanor, calm but firm, stood by her car, her presence commanding but not confrontational. She had parked in a reserved spot, something she was entirely entitled to as a Supreme Court judge, though Peters didn't know that. Instead, he saw someone he believed was challenging his authority. "You think you can park wherever you want?" Peters snapped, his tone harsh. Eleanor's attempt to explain was quickly interrupted. "Don't argue with me. You're in the wrong," he said, dismissing her words before she could finish. His impatience was clear, and the few people nearby began to take notice, some pulling out their phones to record the encounter. Eleanor calmly reached for her documents, speaking in a steady voice. "I have the paperwork to show I'm allowed to park here." But Peters, his face hardening with irritation, waved her off. "I don't need to see that. I know exactly what this is." His words dripped with bias, making it clear that this wasn't about a parking spot anymore. When Eleanor handed him the papers, clearly proving her right to park there, Peters barely glanced at them before crumpling them in his hand and tossing them aside. Gasps from the small crowd followed, but Peters seemed unfazed. His focus remained on asserting his dominance, not on following the rules he claimed to enforce. Eleanor's calmness didn't waver. She stood her ground, refusing to react to his provocations. She spoke clearly, reminding him of her right to park there and urging him to verify her credentials. Peters, however, chose to ignore her completely. "You people think you're above the law," he muttered, loud enough for those nearby to hear. The comment made some in the crowd visibly uncomfortable, their murmurs growing louder. Eleanor remained poised, her years of experience as a judge shining through. She had faced discrimination before and knew the importance of staying composed. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about exposing the unfair treatment she and so many others had endured. She understood that her actions could set an example for everyone watching. Peters, blinded by his arrogance, continued to escalate the situation. His voice grew louder, and his behavior became more aggressive. He was no longer enforcing any rule. He was trying to intimidate Eleanor and assert power he believed she couldn't challenge. But she didn't flinch. She knew she had the truth on her side, and it was only a matter of time before the officer realized how wrong he was. The crowd grew larger, with more people recording the scene and whispering among themselves. They could see Eleanor's calm and reasoned demeanor, and many began to question why Peters was so aggressive. Still, he didn't notice, or didn't care, that his actions were drawing more attention. His pride wouldn't let him admit he might be wrong. Eleanor stood tall, knowing this moment was about much more than a parking spot. It was a chance to highlight the deeper issues of bias and misuse of authority. Though the situation was tense, her steady resolve sent a clear message. She would not back down. Eleanor stood still, her calm expression not changing. Even as Officer Peters's actions became more aggressive, the torn papers on the ground were proof of his refusal to listen. Around them, people started whispering, watching the scene unfold with growing concern. Peters, however, seemed focused only on asserting his power. "Step away from the car," Peters ordered sharply, his voice loud and commanding. Eleanor stepped back, staying composed. She didn't look afraid or defeated. She stood steady, confident in the truth. The crowd watched closely, some beginning to record the situation on their phones. Peters moved toward her car, pretending to look for some issue. He called for backup, making the situation seem far more serious than it was. He muttered something about needing to control the situation, but it was clear to everyone that he was trying to cover for his mistakes. His actions weren't about following the law. They were about his pride. Eleanor spoke calmly. "Officer, you're making a mistake. This could be cleared up if you check my identification properly." Her voice was steady, without anger, but full of quiet strength. Peters ignored her, snapping back, "I don't need you to tell me how to do my job," and turned away as if her words didn't matter. Within minutes, 2 more patrol cars arrived, lights flashing. The officers stepped out, looking around with confusion at the crowd and the growing tension. Peters quickly spoke to them, giving his version of events, making Eleanor sound uncooperative and suspicious. His words were meant to justify his actions, but they didn't match what the witnesses had seen. One of the new officers, noticing the crowd and the cameras, approached Eleanor directly. "Ma'am, may I please see your identification?" he asked politely, his tone softer than Peters'. Eleanor reached into her bag and handed over the same credentials Peters had dismissed earlier. The officer examined them, his expression quickly changing as he realized what he was holding. He looked at Eleanor with surprise and respect. Peters kept talking, not noticing the shift in the situation. "She's just another," he started, but stopped when his colleague interrupted him. "Peters, take a look at this," the officer said, handing over the documents. Peters grabbed the papers and glanced at them. His face went pale as he realized what they were. The ID confirmed Eleanor's position. She wasn't just any citizen. She was a Supreme Court judge. The crowd gasped as the truth spread, and phones captured every moment. Eleanor stayed quiet, letting the facts speak for themselves. Peter's confidence crumbled as panic set in. The other officers exchanged uneasy looks, clearly uncomfortable with what had just happened. This moment wasn't just about Peters. It was a lesson about how prejudice and unchecked power could lead to injustice. Eleanor's quiet strength had revealed the truth, showing everyone that no one is above accountability. Eleanor's credentials were still in Peter's trembling hands, the bold title on her ID unmistakable. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder as the realization spread. Peter's once commanding demeanor was now replaced with visible panic, his arrogance crumbling under the weight of his mistake. The other officers stood awkwardly, uncertain how to proceed, while the crowd's phones remained trained on the scene, capturing every second. The situation turned tense as Peters tried to regain control. "There must be some misunderstanding," he stammered, his words betraying his nervousness. He handed back the ID reluctantly, his eyes darting toward the cameras. Eleanor accepted it calmly, her face still composed despite the escalating tension. Eleanor finally spoke, her voice firm but not raised. "Misunderstanding," she said slowly. "You tore up my identification, accused me without cause, and called for backup to handle a non-existent issue. This isn't a misunderstanding, Officer Peters. It's a misuse of authority." The other officers exchanged glances, realizing the gravity of her words. They were now part of a situation far beyond an ordinary traffic stop. Peters opened his mouth to speak, but Eleanor raised her hand slightly, silencing him without a word. One of the senior officers on the scene approached Eleanor, his tone measured. "Ma'am, we deeply apologize for the inconvenience. We assure you this will be investigated." He turned to Peters, who now stood frozen. "Peters, step back. Now." Eleanor glanced at the senior officer, acknowledging his attempt to defuse the situation. "An apology is a start," she said, her tone steady. "But words aren't enough. This isn't just about me. It's about how often authority is abused, especially when prejudice is involved. There are witnesses here, cameras recording. This moment won't disappear." The senior officer nodded, visibly uncomfortable, but understanding her point. He motioned for the other officers to step away from Eleanor's vehicle, trying to clear the scene. Peters hesitated, still visibly shaken, before backing away slowly. The crowd remained, their focus on Eleanor as she continued. "What happened here is not isolated. It's a reflection of a deeper issue within the system. I've spent my career ensuring justice is upheld, and I won't stop now." Her words resonated with the bystanders, who began clapping and cheering in support. Peters flinched at the sound, his gaze falling to the ground as the weight of his actions became undeniable. The senior officer, recognizing the growing unrest, stepped forward again. "Judge, we will ensure this is addressed immediately. I give you my word." Eleanor nodded, but didn't respond directly. Instead, she turned back to her car, signaling that the moment had ended for her, though its impact was only beginning. The crowd parted as Eleanor drove away, leaving Peters standing amid the murmurs of disapproval and judgment. The scene was over, but its consequences were just starting to unfold. The clapping from the crowd faded, leaving behind an uneasy tension in the air as Eleanor's car disappeared into the distance. Officer Peters stood motionless, the weight of what had just occurred sinking in. The senior officer's parting words, "This will be addressed immediately," echoed in his mind like a warning bell, signaling the gravity of his actions. His colleagues avoided meeting his eyes, their silence more damning than any words. Eleanor, driving away, felt a mixture of relief and determination. She had faced blatant discrimination, but she refused to let this end with personal vindication. This wasn't just about her. It was a reflection of a deeper problem within the system, one that affected countless others who didn't have the voice or platform she did. Eleanor's grip tightened on the steering wheel as she began to mentally outline her next steps. Her resolve was unwavering. This was about more than holding Peters accountable. It was about addressing a system that allowed such abuse of power to persist. The fallout began almost immediately. Videos of the incident, recorded by bystanders, flooded social media platforms within hours. The hashtags number Justice for Eleanor and number End Abuse of Power trended globally, drawing millions of views and sparking widespread outrage. The footage starkly captured the unnecessary aggression displayed by Officer Peters and Eleanor's calm yet commanding response. Comments poured in from people across the world, expressing their support for Eleanor and demanding systemic change. The incident became a flashpoint for discussions about racial discrimination and police accountability. Eleanor wasn't surprised by the public reaction. She knew the moment the videos surfaced that this would gain traction, but she was determined to ensure the momentum translated into meaningful change. She began by reaching out to allies, fellow judges, community leaders, and civil rights organizations. Her office became a hub of activity as she coordinated efforts to turn this isolated incident into a broader call for reform. "This can't just be about me," she told her team during a strategy meeting. "We need to use this moment to shine a light on the systemic failures that make incidents like this possible." Meanwhile, at the police department, the atmosphere was tense. Officer Peters faced immediate scrutiny. His superiors summoned him for an internal inquiry, laying out the public backlash and the damage his actions had caused. "This isn't just about you," a senior officer told him sharply. "This has become a crisis for the entire department." Peters, visibly shaken, attempted to justify his behavior, claiming he acted in the heat of the moment. But his explanations only deepened the frustration of those around him. His colleagues, fearing the repercussions of being associated with him, began to distance themselves. Internal Affairs launched a formal investigation into Peters's conduct. The department, under intense public pressure, announced that Peters had been placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the inquiry. For Peters, the reality of his situation was beginning to set in. The system that had once shielded him now seemed to be turning its back. Eleanor, however, wasn't content to wait for the department's investigation to run its course. She understood that true accountability required pressure from outside the system as well. She worked tirelessly to keep the story in the public eye, granting interviews to major media outlets and highlighting the broader implications of her experience. "This isn't about one bad officer," she said in one interview. "It's about a culture that allows people like him to thrive. That culture needs to change." The community rallied behind Eleanor in ways she hadn't anticipated. Local activists organized peaceful protests, while town halls were filled with people eager to share their own experiences of discrimination and mistreatment. Eleanor made it a point to attend these events, listening to the stories of others and using her position to advocate for change. Her presence was a source of inspiration, turning personal pain into a collective movement for justice. At the same time, Eleanor began working with legal experts and advocacy groups to draft policy recommendations aimed at increasing accountability within the police force. These included mandatory bias training, independent oversight committees, and stricter consequences for officers found guilty of misconduct. Her proposals gained significant attention, sparking discussions at both local and national levels. Within the police department, the investigation into Peters revealed a troubling pattern of behavior. Complaints about his conduct had been filed before, but were dismissed or ignored. The department, now under a microscope, was forced to admit its failings. "We have to own up to this," the police chief said during a press conference. "Mistakes were made, and we are committed to ensuring they are not repeated." Peters's suspension was extended indefinitely, and his case was referred to an external review board for potential criminal charges. The department also announced a series of reforms, including increased transparency in handling misconduct complaints, and a review of past cases to identify patterns of abuse. Eleanor's fight wasn't just about accountability for Peters. It was about creating lasting change. She continued to use her platform to push for reforms, participating in panels and speaking at national events focused on justice and equity. Her efforts resonated with people across the country, many of whom shared their own stories of resilience and hope in the face of adversity. The incident that began with an abuse of power ended with a powerful reminder of what could be achieved through perseverance and collective action. Eleanor's courage and determination inspired a community, challenged a broken system, and set a precedent for holding authority figures accountable. The community continued to rally behind Eleanor, even as the police department grappled with the fallout of the investigation. Her fight was no longer just a personal battle. It had become a beacon for systemic change. The streets, once filled with frustration and injustice, were now vibrant with hope and determination. Banners carried slogans like "Justice for All" and "No More Abuse of Power," and Eleanor's name was frequently mentioned in calls for accountability. Eleanor's dedication to reform gained even more momentum when the department's internal review exposed additional troubling details. Officer Peters, the man at the center of the incident, was revealed to have had multiple prior complaints filed against him. These cases, once dismissed or buried, were now part of a larger narrative about a system that often protected its own at the expense of justice. The revelations spurred further outrage, and the calls for action became impossible to ignore. Eleanor used this moment to amplify her message. She partnered with legal experts, community leaders, and advocacy organizations to draft comprehensive proposals for police reform. These proposals weren't just focused on punishing officers who abuse their power, but also on preventing future injustices. They called for independent oversight committees, mandatory training on racial bias, and policies ensuring greater transparency in investigations. In the meantime, the police department faced mounting pressure to show meaningful progress. The police chief, who had initially downplayed the incident, announced several immediate changes, including a review of past misconduct cases and increased transparency in the disciplinary process. "We have heard the community loud and clear," the chief said during a press conference. "We are committed to rebuilding trust and ensuring that incidents like this never happen again." Eleanor remained at the forefront of the movement, attending protests, participating in public forums, and using her platform to highlight the need for accountability. She was candid in her interviews, often speaking about the emotional toll of her experience and her hope that it would lead to lasting change. "This isn't just about what happened to me," she said during one televised event. "It's about ensuring that no one else has to endure the same injustice." The impact of Eleanor's efforts reached beyond her community. National organizations took notice, and several prominent figures voiced their support. Grassroots movements in other cities began echoing her calls for reform, creating a ripple effect across the country. Eleanor was invited to share her story at national conferences and even testified before a congressional panel on police accountability. As the movement grew, Officer Peters faced the consequences of his actions. After an external review of his case, he was charged with misconduct and eventually dismissed from the force. His actions had not only cost him his career, but had also become a symbol of the systemic issues that needed to be addressed. Peters's fall from grace sent a strong message. Abuse of power would no longer be tolerated. Eleanor's determination inspired others to come forward with their own stories of injustice. These accounts painted a broader picture of the challenges faced by marginalized communities and reinforced the urgency of the reforms Eleanor had been championing. Her advocacy wasn't just about changing policies. It was about changing perspectives and fostering a culture of accountability and respect. In her community, Eleanor was hailed as a hero, but she remained humble. "I didn't do this alone," she often said. "This is the result of a community that refused to stay silent, a group of people who believed in justice and fought for it together." The story didn't end with the reforms passed in Eleanor's city. Her work became a template for other communities looking to address similar issues. The movement she had sparked continued to grow, fueled by the belief that justice was not just an ideal, but a right worth fighting for. Eleanor's resilience and leadership served as a powerful reminder that even in the face of adversity, change was possible. Eleanor's story was now a symbol of hope and resilience, but the journey was far from over. The reforms sparked by her experience were only the beginning of what needed to be a larger transformation. People across the country were watching, inspired by the courage of one woman and her community to demand change. In her city, the first wave of reforms had been implemented, and the police department was undergoing a significant overhaul. New officers were required to attend extensive training on racial equity and community engagement. A civilian oversight board was established, allowing community members to review complaints and hold officers accountable. These steps were monumental, but Eleanor knew they wouldn't mean much unless they were enforced with sincerity and diligence. As the reforms took shape, Eleanor continued to advocate for deeper changes. She addressed town halls, met with city officials, and collaborated with advocacy groups to ensure the momentum wasn't lost. Her speeches were filled with a mix of hope and urgency. "We can't stop now," she said at a public meeting. "This is about more than policy. It's about changing how we see and treat one another." The national spotlight remained on Eleanor's efforts, and her work began to attract new allies, civil rights leaders, legal experts, and even some former law enforcement officers reached out to lend their support. Together, they began drafting a comprehensive blueprint for nationwide reform, focusing on accountability, training, and restoring trust between police and communities. Despite the progress, resistance still lingered. Some members of the police force pushed back against the changes, claiming they were unfairly targeted. Others in the community felt the reforms didn't go far enough. Eleanor faced criticism from both sides but remained steadfast. "Real change takes time," she said in an interview. "It's not about pleasing everyone. It's about doing what's right." One of the most significant moments came when Eleanor was invited to speak at a national conference on justice reform. Standing before a packed audience, she shared her story, not as a victim, but as an advocate for a better future. "I'm here today because my community refused to let injustice define us," she said. "We turned our pain into purpose, and together we proved that change is possible." Her words resonated far beyond the conference. They were shared widely online, sparking conversations in communities across the country. People who had never met Eleanor felt connected to her cause, inspired to address injustices in their own towns. Her vision for a fairer system became a rallying cry for countless others. Back in her city, Eleanor's leadership had helped bridge divides that once seemed insurmountable. Community members and police officers began participating in joint workshops and forums, fostering understanding and mutual respect. The progress wasn't perfect, but it was real, and it was a testament to what could be achieved when people worked together. Eleanor's personal life also saw a shift. The struggle had taken a toll on her, but it had also strengthened her resolve and deepened her connections with her family and community. She found moments of peace in small victories. A new policy passed, a young activist inspired, a neighbor who felt seen and heard. These moments reminded her why she had fought so hard in the first place. The reforms in Eleanor's city became a model for others. Cities nationwide began adopting similar measures, many of them citing Eleanor's story as the catalyst for their own changes. Her name became synonymous with resilience and justice, a reminder that one person's courage could spark a movement. As the months turned into years, Eleanor reflected on how far they had come. The pain of her experience hadn't disappeared, but it had been transformed into something powerful. Her journey was proof that even in the face of overwhelming odds, change was possible when people refused to give up.